I've worked on, as you alluded to, a lot of different things over the last few years. And at the moment, kind of concentrate on an area that I think, interestingly, from an evidence point of view, regulators work in a kind of interesting space in which they rely on evidence to inform some of the activities and actions that happen within the regulated space, but they themselves are not particularly great at doing the kind of evidence gathering and evaluation of the policy approaches they take. And that's one of the things that Ofwat is trying to do a bit more about, and in a number of the bits of Ofwat's work that I cover, we're trying to do a bit more of. So I'm happy to talk about that a bit later on as well, but I'll shut up now and let somebody else talk.
Thanks so much for that, Harry. Yeah, I agree. The CUSPE debate is still ongoing. Bence, would you like to give a bit more information about what you do?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you all today. Yeah, so a few things about myself. So as you mentioned, I studied in Cambridge and during my undergrad, and I actually started to get involved during my PhD when I realized that specializing in a tiny segment of science is not really what I'm interested in. So I started to do a lot of things on the side, and one of them was participating CUSPE events, and I joined the policy challenges with the Cambridge County Council as well in 2017, which was really exciting, and I really enjoyed it. And I think that kind of also gave me a push to go towards policy, and that's how I kind of ended up in Brussels at the European Commission, and more specifically in the European Innovation Council, and which is a very interesting space because they work a lot with scientists and innovators to support them, but also there's a huge feedback to policy on kind of listening to our beneficiaries of what they need and what their problems are, and how policy can help sort out these problems and make Europe more attractive and just generally help innovation. So yeah, this is me in a nutshell.
Great, thanks, Bence. Grace, would you like to give yourself a little bit more of an introduction?
Sure, thanks, Orla. And just to echo what Harry said, I think it's great to see how CUSPE has evolved since I was involved back in 2013-14. It seems like it's grown enormously, and the interest has grown alongside the size of the committee, it seems, which is great to see. So I got interested in policy when I was doing my undergrad, and that's how I ended up on the CUSPE committee. And since then, I've worked, well, I did a year and a half in health policy, but other than that, I've worked in science and research policy, so looking specifically at how policies impact academic research at the moment, anyway. So in my role at UCL, I essentially analyse how the decisions made within UCL, within the institution, and externally to the institution, so the decisions made by funders and government, how all those decisions and policies influence the environment for academic research. And then I look at how we can influence or change those decisions and policies to create a supportive environment for academic research. And one of the areas that I'm particularly passionate about and focusing on at the moment in my role is transparency and reproducibility in research. So that's an area that's been, I think, a hot topic for several years now. And there's a lot of momentum in the sector around prioritising improving that. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but happy to elaborate on any of that during the event.
Thanks. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions about research culture and reproducibility later. James, would you like to introduce yourself now?
Thanks, Orla, and yeah, like everyone else, thrilled to be here. I thought I'd start by maybe providing a bit of clarity on my job title, which sounds rather grandiose, but like many job titles, probably provides more confusion than obvious facts. So whilst it says head of pandemics, I should clarify, I'm not currently working on the COVID-19 response or heading it up, thankfully. Obviously a huge team doing that. I'm working on sort of other future pandemics which may be coming down the line. And obviously that was a function which existed in government before COVID-19, but post-COVID-19, there's a renewed focus on that work, and we're doing some interesting work to consider what we might have learned. And obviously, scientific advice and expertise feeds into that in many ways. And I can talk a bit about how we draw upon that in government. Before that, as Ola mentioned, I worked for the Chief Medical Officer, so Chris Whitty as it is now. So I did spend much of last year on the COVID response, so I can give a bit of insight into that. But before that, I worked for his predecessor, Dame Sally Davis, who many of you may now know as Master of Trinity up in Cambridge. I supported her work, particularly on antimicrobial resistance, and she did quite a lot of international diplomacy work there. It's a slightly different angle I can also shed some light on if of interest to people. And then before that, I was at the Wellcome Trust, which, big health and health research funder. So again, that was more of the I guess what we broadly term policy for science rather than science for policy. So I've ended up with a pretty kind of consistent health focus in my career, but a few different angles on it and covering the span. So very happy to go into any of those as the interest takes us. Thanks, Ola.
Great, thanks. So while other people are thinking of questions, remember do pop them in the chat as soon as you think of any. This event obviously is about policy for science and science for policy, as we mentioned. So I was just wondering what all of your perspectives are on how evidence influences policy making in your different roles, or how maybe, through your policy work, you're influencing science. So who would like to come in on that first?
Happy to have a first stab, Ola.
That'd be great, thanks.
I think we were discussing this on a bit of a pre-brief here amongst the panel, and I think it's first, important to say evidence plays a huge. If I take my current example and think about government policy, evidence and expertise plays a huge part in forming government policy. But I also think it's worth highlighting that, as Mark Walport, the former government chief scientific advisor, like to say, there are several lenses in which we, look at government policy, and I guess the sort of specific deep disciplinary scientific expertise that many here will be familiar with is just one of those lenses. And to give you an idea of when for example, I send something up to ministers with recommendations on various options, as I put it together in what's called a submission, I will be considering, yes, I will have a section which may bring in the expertise of my clinical, colleagues over at Public Health England who really know the area, coming in with that public health profession hat on. I may bring in the expertise from, an independent advisory committee like NERVTAG, which is the Novel and Emerging Respiratory Threats Assessment Group. Again, academics with years of experience looking at, flu modeling. That will be a core part of my submission. But on top of that, I will have a section on legal. What is the legislative framework that we're working in? That will determine the options we can take. There may be some legal risk in a particular course of action we're taking in terms of, objections by people. There'll be a commercial aspect, and that would be not just what are the immediate financial implications of what we can spend, but from more of a kind of strategic commercial perspective, what are the considerations here if we're thinking about long-term vaccines policy? How much of that do we want to be onshored or offshored? How can we make that work in a much bigger ecosystem way? And we'll be weighing all these things up before we come to a recommendation for ministers, as well as the wider government strategy. So I guess that's one sort of aspect I want to pull out, that there is expertise across government that Department and civil servants draw upon, but it is just one aspect of it. I guess the other thing to say, though, is having said there's expertise, I've only been in the Department of Health and Government. I suspect DHSC is one where, particularly after the last 18 months, we are particularly adept at drawing upon evidence and expertise and have a lot of these expert standing committees. But most civil servants are very much generalists, and I count myself in that group. Whilst I come from a background of intellectual curiosity, I have no more than a master's, and that was in the history and philosophy of science. So we are there to corral and draw in the evidence and expertise, and these sort of things where we build up the skills and the connections so we know where to look and how to interpret some of that evidence and where to get it, I think really important. You know, and great that we can try and strengthen those.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear how evidence is currently informing policy at a government level. All right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just to build on what James was saying, I think, you know, the balance, as you were saying, between, you know, some legal aspects or some other types of evidence or information or insights, I think varies quite a lot between organizations that you're talking about. So, for example, so in Ofwat, because it is an economic regulator, kind of economic evidence and economic models tend to predominate in the way that it kind of thinks about certain things. So I think even within the evidence piece, that, you know, you've got to think about it from that point of view. And I think what's interesting there is that you then also get quite a, and this is the thing that comes out, you know, very obviously when you look at how information and ideas get into government or into policy, that a lot of it is ideas based and not necessarily evidence based, but the way that you present that evidence, so the kind of insight and story that you put on top of it, and that's really kind of important and powerful, but at the same time can be quite frustrating, I think, from, you know, a scientist or an evidence builder's point of view, because sometimes it can be used to tell a story that you're not trying to tell, or you know, it does things that you don't intend. But I think it's worth keeping that in mind, and a lot of you know, kind of the people that we deal with as external organizations, a lot of them are think tanks who that's their kind of bread and butter, and they're kind of the you know, the broker of information and ideas into insights and ideas as a way to present to policy. And so you kind of have to play with that game a little bit. And at the same time, it's also worth remembering that, and I've done a fair amount of this in different spaces, that, you know, it's not always academia that's generating information and ideas and that evidence. Actually, quite a lot of it is done in companies or by other types of organizations who don't tend to be as rigorous as academia is, and that can be quite problematic. And there are lots of organizations that try and incentivize better evidence building through those organizations, and I think that's a really interesting area that, to be honest, is kind of slightly underexplored. So there are some good organizations like the What Works centers, and you know, different organizations related to those. So Nesta has this innovation growth lab that tries to support you know, more randomized controlled trials in policy spaces, and policy itself is a kind of, can be an evidence creator, but quite often isn't, and you know, this is always talked about, but a lack of thinking about how you evaluate policy approaches is a real issue, and I think it's you know, one for us and one for lots of other regulators in particular, partly because of kind of what they do and the sensitivities of what they do. They don't tend to think about it, but we should think about evidence creation, you know, more broadly than kind of science to policy. And I think you know, that creates opportunities as well. So if you want to move out of you know, the space of pure research and science, there are still lots of opportunities where you can do that research building and build those insights on top of it, and kind of, you know, sell it on and do something valuable with it. So yeah, anyway, so there's just some additional things.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Harry and James just said, and I just want to add on to that I think sometimes the method that evidence is gathered for policy is somewhat different than the scientific method. So I've seen a lot of cases where there is a idea for a policy, and then then evidence is gathered in support, and it's kind of like a debate on both sides of everyone, like brings like, I think we should go in this way, and this is the evidence I could find to build up and support in my my initiative, and whereas someone else goes with another initiative and they present the ideas, and then it's kind of but in my experience, it becomes more and more common that you don't just say that I think this would be a good initiative, but you need to back it up with data and some research, because otherwise it's becoming harder and harder to pass policies.
Yeah, I think it's really good to hear that policies are now becoming more evidence informed compared to at least from the past, but there's still some ways to go, I think, from what you're all saying as well. But also the fact that we need to take in different perspectives is not purely on data all the time. It's also remembering that policies are influencing people, so you have to remember the people too. Grace, perhaps you can come in more on how policy informs science, I suppose, or influences science, as that's more the area that you work in.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to make a brief point about the previous question, which is, I suppose, some people might imagine that the process of evidence informing policy is quite linear and straightforward, but actually it's very messy. And the idea of evidence in a research context is quite distinct from what might be considered evidence in a policy context. I mean, you only have to look at select committee inquiries, and when they launch a call for evidence, they're not talking about research evidence in the way we would think about it. They're talking about, you know, anyone can submit their views, and that counts as evidence to the inquiry. So it's not necessarily the case that research evidence, sort of hard data, and I don't even want to say facts, because the process of research doesn't always generate hardcore facts, but I suppose research evidence doesn't necessarily exceed other evidence in terms of the way it's seen by policymakers. But your point about how policy impacts science, I suppose if you think about the way science works or the way research more broadly works, it takes place in microenvironments going up to macro environments. So you've got, you know, you're working in a research group, or if you're in arts and humanities, maybe you're working with a couple of people rather than in a traditional science type research group. But you've got your sort of micro environment, and then you've got your department, you've got your university, and then you've got the entire system. And it might feel a little bit removed from you as a PhD student or a researcher. You know, what decisions are made by government, they may seem quite distant, but actually the decisions made by government, made by funders, really do trickle down. I suppose one example of where it can feel quite impactful to the day-to-day life of a researcher is the issue of short-term contracts. And that's an example of, you know, most postdocs are on short-term contracts, and that's a result of the way in which the entire system is funded. So a very sort of high-level macro decision in terms of the way the funding system works translates to impacts on people's lives and people's careers and the shape of them. So science doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a system where there are incentives and ways of working that fundamentally impact the way science and research are done, particularly when you think about things like questionable research practices and people trying to get their, you know, paper published in Nature and this kind of thing. That impacts the way in which people actually conduct their research, the way they publish it, what they do and don't share, etc.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. We've had a few comments or questions in the chat now, so that's great. So one question that sort of relates to what we've been discussing so far is, how does policy creation proceed in instances where experts disagree on what the best course of action is? James, would you like to come in first on that? Because I feel like you probably have quite a lot of experience in that field, in that area.
Yeah, so I think probably what's first to note is that the best way for an expert advisor to government to act, and a civil servant to interact with them, is not to ask necessarily the expert what the best course of action is. Because as I just sort of mentioned, actually policy decisions end up taking into account all sorts of things. And, you know, if you watch Chris Whitty up on the podium, you know, for the last year and a half, what you will notice is he does not say, we need to lock down now, you know, I recommended this exact decision. He will say it is up to ministers as elected, you know, representatives to make the trade-offs between the economics and the health effects and etc. in doing this. But what I can say as an expert on the matter is that locking down now will very likely reduce cases by X, etc. So in some ways you're trying to avoid in too many cases a situation where you are being prescribed a specific course of action solely by the experts, unless it's on quite a technocratic issue. So to Richard's question also in the chat, which is about NICE, which ranks the evidence coming in, I'll just note that there are specific areas of which are very technically expert led, where actually we do, and ministers do, devolve out the responsibility to act independently to the Medicines Health Regulatory Authority or NICE or something like that, and the decisions are out of ministers' hands. But in most cases, actually the final action is always going to be a trade-off. Having said that, of course, you're still then relying upon some expert input. But the question ends up being framed a bit differently, and what you're asking the experts to perhaps come to an opinion on, or a judgment on, I should say, is their expert opinion based on the evidence they've seen on what the likelihood is of X achieving X, etc. And what you tend to find in these committee formats, or certainly the ones I've observed, is that this consensus, this group of experts do discuss and come to sort of essentially a consensus decision, or consensus advice, I should say, which will typically, provide in some form a degree of probability or certainty around a particular finding. So, we think that closing schools at this point is likely to reduce the R rate by X amount based upon this modelling, and very much that that committee forum is there to sort of try and tease that out. But in the advice they provide, if there is disagreement or a degree of uncertainty, that is presented as much as possible. And that's where the best, people like Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance as Government Chief Scientific Advisor do a really important job in translating that quite complex scientific debate or uncertainty into a language which is understandable by ministers and allows them to recognise, how far they can go on the evidence. Yeah, I'll stop there and let any others come in.
Anyone else like to come in on disagreements and within experts, between experts? Harry?
I think speed plays a massive role in this. Two things: so speed and lack of capacity within public sector more generally, but particularly civil service, I think play a massive factor in this. Most decisions have to be made very quickly, and the civil service generally, since it's been kind of reduced in size for most departments, a few have grown, they just don't have the time to engage with a lot of the nuance, let's say, of some of the evidence, or kind of what different approaches might mean, and as a result, I think to a certain extent policy just carries on even if there's disagreement, and to a certain extent it's down to, as Jen was saying, ministers' discretion, which as much as Ben was saying earlier, is to do with what they want to happen from the beginning, and that will maybe sway the kind of final decisions. And I think you do see it a lot, right, that ministers will have a certain bee in their bonnet about something, or they see, let's say, if we put these two things together, there's a nice solution for two problems that I have, and actually the solution doesn't work for anybody, but it kind of looks nice, and then they'll kind of go full steam ahead on it. So I think all of those things make a big difference to how much evidence is taken into account, and that disagreement is taken into account into the process, which to a certain degree isn't enough, I think.
Ben, so you have your hand raised. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I would just want to add that, like, I was lucky enough to work with an expert group last year and they were giving us recommendation on some internal processes, but on like how we should support our beneficiaries to make the most impact. And what I found really interesting is that I think most of them, if not all of them, had experience with working with policy before, and they, in the discussion, it was very clear of their understanding of they giving their best advice, but knowing that that's not the full picture, and they gonna list us 12 things, and they would be very happy if 6 of them being taken on. but they're going to write the other 6 as well, just in case, to inform us. And they requested information from our side as well to understand the limitations, so they can give the best advice. So it was a really nice experience of them also understanding the limitation from the policy side, that we might not be able to go to the fully standard what they think would be the best, but they acknowledged this and they gave their best advice that way.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Ben.
Can I just add, because I think
Go ahead.
you're making a good point there as well, that relationships make a really big difference in this, right? So even if you've got a couple of different experts providing insights, one of them might be more adept at the policy process and just have a better relationship with their civil servants or that minister, and that makes a big difference. And so in terms of advice or thinking about you know, from a researcher's point of view, or even, you know, if you're kind of going into a more policy space but still influencing into the main machinery of government, that relationship is really critical. And knowing who the kind of key person who makes the wheels turn, and that might not be the most senior person, but you know, somebody more junior who's just got the right ear of the minister or whatever it is, that makes a huge difference in what gets taken forward and what doesn't get taken forward in the process.
So it's all about who you know, is what you're saying. Grace, did you want to come in on that, or we could address Richard's question?
I think feel free to move on to the next question.
Okay, well, I'll quickly bring in Richard's question here, as it's, again, related. So Richard asked about evidence quality, where he mentioned NICE, which is the NHS body that decides, among other things, which drugs to fund, tries to rank evidence based on whether it's from a randomized controlled trial or a large observational study or just expert opinion. Does government and governmental committees try to evaluate the evidence they receive? So it's kind of similar to what we were talking about, but maybe more looking at evaluation.
I think that's probably quite a big discrepancy between the way evidence is considered in arm's length bodies, I think, if you would consider NICE to be an arm's length body, versus central government. So NICE is very specialised in what it does, has to sort of evaluate the impact of certain treatments and interventions, and in almost a sort of economic way, looking at financial implications and quality of life years, etc., etc. So it has to be very, very rigorous in the way that it develops its policies. I would imagine that within central government, things would be a lot more varied in the way that evidence is evaluated. James is probably a better place to talk about that. I suppose I know a little bit more about select committees and how they work. They're not governmental committees, they're parliamentary committees. And usually they're generalists and they might look at a specialist topic. For example, the Science and Technology Committee might look at R&D funding, but most of them won't be scientists or people who have like particular expertise in that area. So I wouldn't expect that they would have a sort of rigorous system for evaluating the evidence that comes in, also taking into account the point made earlier about the way that evidence is seen in some areas, such as in inquiries, is that it's not just about research evidence, it's also about people's opinions. And I suppose it relates also to the discussion that we've just had about evidence can tell you, perhaps with probabilities, what might or might not happen if you take a certain course of action. But the evidence itself can't tell you what the right course of action is. Right? Someone needs to be making the decision. And I suppose that's the distinction between the evidence and the policy. So it's not necessarily the case that there's always a right course of action, but politicians won't necessarily take it because they're biased, right? It's a system where there is no one right course of action. There are so many different things you can take, different courses of action you can take. And those courses of action are not just dependent on what the research evidence says. But I don't know if, James, you wanted to add anything about how government evaluates the evidence it receives.
Just very briefly, I think there is a ranking of evidence, but it's quite informal, and it happens via intermediaries, by which I mean, again, the submission I send up to ministers is very unlikely to include a ranking for them of the different types of evidence I found and a breakdown. You know, what I'll include will be a summary, and most likely that will be informed by my, you know, more expert colleagues at Public Health England or the Chief Medical Officer, and they're the ones who would have done, you know, the mental sifting and sorting and formed an opinion on, you know, summarising what the evidence says, and they will have been in the place to interrogate which piece of evidence was stronger or less strong. So certainly so I suggest it rarely happens in that sort of very formal way that maybe NICE do it, but it does work its way in, and there should be, and you know, and almost all departments have these scientific advisors and others who are there to sort of check the quality of evidence going up. There should be a degree of sifting and ranking. Yeah.
Ben, so do you want to come in there, or should we move on to the next?
Yeah, but James pretty much said exactly what I wanted to say, so I think just move on to the next question so we can finish them all.
Okay, that's great. We've had a few questions related to sort of the relationship between the public, policymakers and science. So Lara had a question about, well, basically asking your thoughts on the relationship between the public and science, or science in the realm of policy formation. And then a related question is, could you give an example of a policy that you've passed that has seen benefits to the public? I guess it might be quite different questions, but try to cover them both at the same time. Anyone want to come in first on that one? Maybe.
I'm happy to come in Laura's question, but this is so my point of view is from the European Commission, which is not a political body, but the executive arm. So we love science and evidence because then we can say that it's not a random decision that we made, but it's based on something else. So it's also a form of deflecting blame if anything goes wrong. So that's one of the reasons that at least at the European levels, that civil servants really like external validation from, and that actually can be anything from a public survey that can gauge of what the public wants, or to scientific opinion. So I think in that relationship, it is science is very much trusted and needed, and we don't have that lucky. At least I'm happy that we don't have that level of political play in our daily work.
I can come in on the point about public trust in science. Well, famously a few years ago, Michael Gove made comments about how the public had had enough of experts, and I think that was in relation to there being lots of different evidence-based, views or points being made in relation to Brexit, and I think politicians were sort of using evidence to advance their own agenda in a way that sometimes seemed contradictory because everyone had their own evidence that backed up what they were saying, even if it was different to what the other people were saying. I do feel like the response to the pandemic and the role that scientists have played, particularly in developing a vaccine, has helped to undo a lot of that distrust. But I also wonder if that distrust was more something that was seen within political circles more so than, I don't know if anyone actually did a survey of, representative survey of the public to see how public trust in science had changed. I think sometimes these things can get picked up by the media and then suddenly it's the new reality, but actually that the new reality might not actually be the current reality, it might just be the narrative of that political time.
I'll just very briefly come in on this, having seen various sides of it recently. It's interesting, and I think prior to COVID-19, you'd rarely see, if a new policy was announced, you'd rarely see, well, it depends, but the evidence base was either probably not commented on at all, or if it was the subject of comment, it was probably in a negative way in that it was generating a lot of controversy, whether that's a Heathrow expansion or badger culling. What I would say is, some of you may recall a debate early on when the SAGE minutes weren't being published, in a very timely way. And I think that's what that has shown is, whatever the decision, there's generally benefit in being transparent and showing, the debate and the underlying evidence, even if it's not conclusive, even if it does show that, the evidence cannot take you all the way to the decision and there has to be a ministerial decision and trade-offs on top. It generates a trust, whereas, and there'll always be, there will always be some dissenting voices, including in the scientific community, and the creation of an independent SAGE this time around, suggests that other people wanted to have those voices heard. But again, airing that and having that out there, I think generally helps build confidence, even if it isn't conclusive in one direction or another.
I can come and make a slightly or have a slightly different conversation, and that's, I think this is more from the point of the universities, but I think there is, in terms of regional development, we often talk about anchor institutions, and universities are potentially, and have been, I think, in some circumstances, really important anchor institutions within local development, but I don't think probably enough. And where it has happened, they build a really good relationship with the local community, and there's a real sense of importance that goes beyond just the science of it, but also the value of having those institutions locally, because they offer, more than just the science benefit. And I think more of that would be great, and especially when we're talking about leveling up, across the country. And this, I guess, is where things like the ref is meant to come in and try and incentivize some of this. But I'm not. This is not my space, but I'm not sure any of that works particularly well to really incentivize that greater collection. But maybe as a kind of call out to those on the call today, that the more you can do to even do your little bit to be more of an anchor institution and connect, I think the better the public trust, across science and academia is, and then therefore evidence potentially.
Yeah, I completely agree. So as I'm sure a lot of people in our audience are early career researchers, I just wanted to ask you a bit more maybe about your career trajectories, and sort of what sort of skills make you successful in your role, or people successful in the role that you have. So yeah, anyone would like to come on that?
I can go first. I only caught half of that question, so I'll go with what I caught. so maybe first, kind of important skills, and interested to hear the rest of the panel's thoughts on this. So I think for me, actually, the most important skills have been the social skills. So being able to go and communicate and engage and question. And some of that comes from, more of, what you could call an academic, evidence-based background. I think some of those skills provide something that others who come into policy without that kind of potentially scientific, particularly background, is important. But it is generally, can you work well with people? More so than often, unfortunately, happens in academia, is the working within a team and being able to be effective in a team. And that's really critical. So the more experience I think you can get of doing that kind of stuff, the better. Then the other stuff is, as James was saying earlier, I would regard myself as a generalist too. Just embrace everything and anything. I think most of my career has been kind of moving from one thing to another, based partly on luck or just the situation, and finding areas where it's clear there is a need, but also there's a want for change, or a want for information and ideas, and then jumping on that and trying to, you know, the more experience you have of different places, I think the more you get a feel of where those gaps are, where there's a need and a want, and then, you know, try and fill them. I think is the thing you want to try and do, and you know, building up as much experience as you can do is I think kind of critical for that.
Yeah, I'd agree with Harry. I think when I think about the skills needed in a policy-related career, there is a large chunk of them which I would say are related in many ways to the process of doing research. So the analytical side, so policy analysis, including any data analysis that you might be doing, and things like being able to explain a complex topic in a clear way that's concise and accessible. Perhaps that takes things a little bit more of a step towards not so much public engagement, but engagement with policymakers, rather than the way you would do that in science, because you typically be communicating to scientists. But I suppose if we can look at it in terms of like the analytical skills, and then, as Harry has described, the social skills, and I suppose the analytical skills do flow quite nicely from working in science or research, whereas the social skills are the sorts of things that you have to practice and learn a little bit more, I would imagine. And I would echo what Harry said about really just embracing opportunities. I think I certainly found that very helpful to me in my career, just being unashamedly keen to engage with people, to take opportunities. You know, the way that I first sort of found out about the policy world was by reading a magazine that was actually developed by the Wellcome Trust. And they had a feature on careers from a biology degree. And one of the people who was interviewed as part of that feature worked in science policy at Cancer Research UK. And I thought her job sounded interesting. So I found her email address on the internet and contacted her and asked if I could shadow her for a couple of days, which I didn't really think was that significant at the time, but it led to me getting work experience for a week and a half, which then led to me applying to an internship at the Wellcome Trust, which was then 2 months of experience. And that gave me a massive leg up on applying for jobs. So I do think these little feelers you can put out, they really have a sort of compounding effect over time. And especially in the context of networking, you know, the people you know, you can then find out about other opportunities through them. And I don't know, when I've spoken to people about advancing their careers, and I'm sort of very, you know, I encourage people, oh, have a look on LinkedIn, find people who do a job that you think looks interesting, contact them. And I often see that people have a little bit of, you know, they're a bit reluctant to do that because they're scared, you know, people won't be that keen to engage with them, or they won't get a response. But actually, you know, I've been contacted by people on LinkedIn who I don't know, and I've done the same to other people. And without fail, my experience is, yeah, sometimes you don't get a response, but when people do respond, which is most of the time, they're actually really engaged and really interested and willing to help and have a chat. So I would really say put yourself out there, and it might be that policy turns out not to be the area that you want to work in. Maybe it doesn't work for you, but taking that approach for all sorts of different career is a really good way to expose yourself to the different things that are out there, rather than having to actually do a full-time job in something to find out that it's not quite what works for you, or that it is what works for you.
Thanks, Grace. That's lots of really great advice you gave there. James or Bence, would you like to come in on the sort of skills that are required for your role and how maybe they could be developed from while still studying or in the early part of people's careers?
So first, I just echo what Grace said. Actually, as you alluded to in my introduction, the first kind of contact I had with this world was when doing my master's. And I just picked a topic which looks at a big decision which we made about science policy, and went in blind to this area, but picked up the phone or sent emails out blind, cold to a few people. And it was amazing how willing some pretty senior people were to speak on this. And then I shadowed Julian Huppert, who was the Cambridge MP at the time and scientific background. He was very happy to have me for a day. And as Grace says, these accumulation of fairly small things, but gives you a much wider awareness of the context. And on that note, I think, a lot of you would have heard, I'd reinforce the importance of practicing writing for different audiences, that sort of communication, but also the wider political awareness. And I sort of mean small p and big P, the kind of, as Harry said, ministers and others, in the sphere, the decision makers generally approach the decisions they're making from a sort of narrative point of view, whether that's, they're making a manifesto commitment, there's political pressure from the opposition on something, a decision needs to be made very rapidly because suddenly something has hit the front page of the Telegraph. If you become, the pace, there's a big difference in the pace of evidence generation and policy decision making, and policy decision making is often far more reactive than evidence making. And so if you're too absorbed in the evidence decision making thing, it's just quite a narrow lens. So even just signing up something like the Politico daily newsletter, which gives a pretty gossipy inside look at what's going on in Westminster and what's driving decisions, particularly at the moment where a lot of those is about coronavirus, you just get a much better informal sense of the real undercurrents of where decision making is coming from and what people are responding to. And it can be occasionally depressing to realize, how directly the front pages of, one tabloid or another is driving, the policies 2 days later. But it gives you an insight into that a bit, I think. So I'd recommend that as well.
Thanks, James. I'll be signing up for that straight after this meeting. Bence, how about you? Obviously, you work at the European Commission, so any interesting insights about skills that are maybe needed there?
Well, I think it's pretty much what everyone else has said, and I just I think if it's a transition from science to policy, it's normally the people skills that one wants to work on a little bit, because you would have the analytical skills, and you're probably going to be one of the best analytical minds in the institution. Well, at least the Commission is very heavy on political science backgrounds and economists, so the science part is already like quite a good foundation. And I think what I would just add to is to keep your mind, minds open to like make new connections and because you never know what will be helpful. And I think it's in my work as well, it is super relevant, because sometimes I would be working with someone on one initiative, and then we just end up chatting about like, oh, what else do you do? And then a few months later, I work on something else, and I realize like, oh, this would be a really good synergy with this other person, and I just get them involved, and that adds to our work. So I think combining as many things, and that works at a personal level as well. Like combining different skills is going to make you more unique and more suitable for something. So I would just recommend to not stress too much about like I need this list of skills, just because, or at least for me, what happened is I always did what sounded interesting. So I started I read about CUSPE in a newsletter. I was like, this sounds interesting, and then I ended up doing the policy challenges, and then ended up in a very similar field. But that was kind of a coincidence, and so yeah, just do what you enjoy doing.
Yeah, definitely doing what you enjoy and taking opportunities is what I'm getting from this. So we've hit 6 o'clock, but we started a little bit late. So I'll just ask one final question that I'm very interested in. And if you could just give me an answer to that question, and also just any final points that you have. So my last question is quite simple. It's just, what is your most favorite and least favorite part of your current job? And then, yeah, any final statement, any final comments you have for our audience today? Harry.
So I can go first. Yeah, I think my favorite bit is the breadth of stuff that I end up doing, and you know, to a certain extent, the trying to get people on your side, right? You know, sell the ideas that you're trying to push, or try and sell the kind of evidence or insights that you're trying to push. And you know, it's a challenge, but it's quite fun as well, and quite rewarding when you manage to shift an organization's focus in a particular direction or something. I think it's also the most frustrating when you're up against, particularly, and I think this is more true now than it has been maybe in past years, up against you know, let's say robust opinions from members of parliament and ministers. That can be very frustrating to try and fight against, especially on things that can feel kind of obvious, or you know, no-go areas, or something like that. Yeah, so sometimes banging your head against a brick wall is a bit frustrating.
Thanks, Harry. Grace, yeah.
Sure. So I would say one of the things that I most enjoy is being able to feel close to the world of science and research, which is something I didn't want to give up. I didn't want to work in a lab, but I wanted to do something related to science and research, and I feel like policy is a really good way to stay close to that world, and also to feel like you have the opportunity to have an impact on it. So that's, I guess, quite a privileged position to be in. The flip side, I suppose, is a lot of the work that you can do in policy, you might not necessarily see a clear outcome from it. So you might be working really, really hard on a particular area, but it's quite hard to disentangle the impacts that you're having from the impacts of other things, because it's quite a messy arena. So I guess sometimes there is a level of doubt of how much impact am I actually having. But I think the times when you can see it more tangibly make up for the times when you can't.
That's really good to know. James?
Best bit similar to Grace is particularly in my current role, the proximity I've managed to maintain to sort of subjects I love, and experts who are genuinely world leading in what they do, and you know, having superb access to that and just fascinating conversations, and you know, then being able to translate that into potentially policy at quite rapid pace. And you know, this may be a debate that some of you face when you consider, if you do want to go into policy future, whether you work inside or outside of government, move between the two. You know, definitely arguments for and against, but certainly working in government, you know, sometimes that pace of policy making does mean you can have a very big impact, you know, fairly early on in your career as well, which is very exciting. The flip side of working in government is that you are, as is quite appropriate, but you know, accountable to the public and to MPs and so on. But that means, you know, you get all these parliamentary questions and freedom of information requests coming in, which, you know, are normally completely manageable. Under current circumstances, you can imagine there's quite a few coming in which have pandemics somewhere in their title, and take up far too much of my day searching back through archives and digging things up. But yeah, so I'd pick that out as a specific of the day-to-day job where I can feel some frustration. On a more strategic level, I'd also say pandemic preparedness is fascinating sort of topic to consider from a distance. Obviously, at the moment, huge amount of interest, but most of the time, you know, pre-COVID, the last major pandemic we had was 2009 swine flu, which actually turned out to be, you know, thankfully, very low impact. Before that, it was sort of going back to HIV. Essentially, you're doing a lot of work to prepare for something which you hope doesn't happen, and you know, at worst, kind of happens roughly once every 20 years. So it's how do you maintain that interest and maintain your readiness in those fallow periods for something which, when it strikes mercilessly potentially. So that's a tricky challenge to grapple with.
Yeah, I think.
And yeah. So I think what I enjoy the most is the kind of the purpose and the potential impact of my work. So especially like in my current role with the greenhouse gas program, we have like a really tangible target of reducing the greenhouse gas emission of our beneficiaries by 5% during the 2-year time of the program, which is like something that I can really identify with and like really motivated by. So that's, I definitely feel really passionate about. And on the downside, I would say that what frustrates me quite often is the level of bureaucracy, which is, I think, like after leaving the UK and moving to Brussels, it definitely went up. But sometimes I feel like we spend a lot of time on steps, which I do understand they're important because they provide checks and balances, but I think from a science perspective, it's definitely a new thing that I'm struggling with.
From what I've heard, that's quite a common feeling. But yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thank you to the panelists for your insights on everything from science, evidence-informed policy and your careers so far. And thank you to the attendees for joining. I know it must be very tempting to get out in the sun and meet your up to 6 people this evening. So I hope you're going to do that now. And yeah, so if you want to hear more about CUSPE events, I've just put a link here to our website. We don't have anything coming up for the rest of this term, but look out for some things next term and into next year. We'll be opening up applications for the CUSPE committee very soon as well, if you want to get engaged. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Bye.